Stand and fight. Soldier First Class. Zack!
Genesis. And Geo. And I.
Sephiroth!
Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion is the 2022 remake of the 2007 game originally released on the PSP. It's a hack-and-slash JRPG that serves as the prequel to Final Fantasy VII, and it lies somewhere between the realms of remake and remaster. Reunion is incredibly faithful to the original and didn't receive the same level of overhaul that Final Fantasy VII Remake did. For people who are here just because they want to know how much prettier the game is compared to the original, I'll present it to you like this. The gameplay of Reunion looks comparable to the cutscenes of the original, while the cutscenes of Reunion look comparable to the gameplay of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now without further ado, let's get into it. While returning fans will already know this, it's important for new fans to know that Crisis Core effectively served as a secret prototype for what would eventually become Final Fantasy VII Remake back when the original released on PSP. It shares a ton of its DNA with Remake, although with some of the growing pains of being the pioneer game that it was. Incredibly unique and experimental mechanics, weird choices and obsession with one-off minigames, and of course, taking Final Fantasy VII from this to this. All of this and more is going to be explored later, but for now, we need to touch on one of the more lackluster design fumbles of the game. The game unfortunately has a good number of exercises in tedium. There's an entire chapter where you chase one of the game's villains, wherein the gameplay loop is see him, chase, interrupted, fight, see him, chase, interrupted, fight, over and over and over again. That same chapter includes a wave clear segment where you just have to keep getting into combat over and over until stuff stops spawning, and believe it or not, that isn't even the worst offender since you're at least doing something engaging for those. There's a point where you need to build a flower wagon for Aerith by finding materials on the ground, but every single material is just a random sparkling item icon, so the only way to know what you need is to literally check every single thing and go through every text box and every micro cutscene. Arguably the worst offender though is when Zack gets his wallet stolen. Yes, actually. You need to run around and talk to every single NPC in the area where you got robbed, but not before you attempt to leave once, because only after you attempt to leave the first time will then every NPC be able to talk to you about the missing wallet and not just have random dialogue. And only after you talk to every NPC about the wallet will you then just be allowed to leave and get on with the game that you were probably here for in the first place. But regardless of the more monotonous sections, Crisis Core Reunion offers replayability in the form of New Game Plus, which is always good, and even though they can be repetitive, the ridiculous amount of optional missions that ramp in difficulty will give players a ton of content to grind through at their heart's content. These include rematches against many of the game's bosses, and a boss rush mode is also always good, further explorations of side characters like Yuffie, and fleshing out the world of Final Fantasy VII. Like, for example, the time that you realize after the fact that you helped the young niece of Don Corneo by clearing the slums of monsters. The world of Final Fantasy VII is well done and interesting, if a bit difficult to understand thanks to the nature of the intentionally vague writing. It's a steampunk fantasy setting that draws on inspiration from several different real-life mythologies, particularly seen in the naming conventions of locations and the different kinds of creatures that you can summon. Granted, a majority of the steampunk elements are localized to the main city of Midgar, but even in other nations entirely, you'll run into enemies wielding gun halberds. On a more particular note to this game, Reunion's levels are often linear in a bad way. Take, for example, the aforementioned chapter where you chase down that villain. The entire level is just a straight corridor where essentially you just hold forward and get stopped over and over until you've tried going forward for long enough that it works. Meanwhile, the bits that aren't linear often tend to get very repetitive, specifically with the missions. There are, however, a decent variety of biomes for the missions: seaside, caves, farms, slums, depths, etc., but the number of times you're likely to visit each of those maps will make them feel very repetitive. Despite this, however, Reunion has the player visit multiple other locations wherein each one is specifically relevant to a given character. Almost no areas in the game are pointless fluff, save for arguably Junon. For Shinra and every character affiliated with them, there's the upper city of Midgar. For Zack, there's Gongaga. For Cloud, there's Nibelheim. For Yuffie, there's Wutai. For Angeal and Genesis, you get Benora. Aerith gets the slums, and Sephiroth gets the Nibel reactor and Shinra Manor, and so on. Almost everywhere you go, regardless of how long you stay there, is significant from a storytelling perspective and builds out the world. So while the level design on a micro level in terms of traversal or interesting gameplay tends to fall flat, the choice of how those levels operate on a macro level and relate to the world at large all serves to emphasize what Final Fantasy VII did best to begin with. Reunion gave me next to zero glitches or hiccups of any kind, which deserves particular congratulations, seeing how I played the entire game on the 1.0 release edition of the game. Genuinely, bravo to Square Enix for releasing such a polished product like this. I have notes that Tifa apparently ran through a water tower in Nibelheim at one point, but I actually can't find the footage for that. There is one thing, however, that does arguably belong in here: an exploit. Enemy spawning in both missions and latter sections of the game become obnoxious and constantly grant a lurching effect every time you try to run anywhere. While the constant respawning of mobs can be extremely useful, if practically necessary for grinding levels and endgame materia, it can also become very frustrating for players who just want to go from point A to B. That said, there's an extremely easy exploit for this. Every single enemy spawn zone in a combat area could be visualized something like this. Every area that isn't a small corridor can be a combat zone except for the outermost edge of that arena. If you do nothing but run into the walls, no enemies will spawn and you're allowed to traverse the maps freely. Clearly, this was not intended, as there is a dedicated game mechanic which allows the player to leave combat that they don't want to fight. If you run at a barrier of a combat zone while in combat for just a few seconds, a circle will fill and you'll be allowed to flee from that combat. This would never have been implemented if there was a way to just avoid combat altogether at your choosing. Fortunately, this exploit isn't exactly game-breaking and is instead actually incredibly convenient to a point where it arguably elevates the game. In a strange way, it almost feels necessary because of how much better the game will feel and flow once you stop getting jumped every 20 yards by more mobs. It does, however, take away whatever immersion this admittedly arcadey game had by having to watch Zack grind his face against a wall everywhere he runs. Hey there. Thank you so much for watching this far into the video. Most people don't. Please consider subscribing if you like these kinds of reviews. Always remember that unattainable dreams are the best kind, and of course, beware spoilers from this point forward. Reunion's story is a means to an end that became much more than the sum of its parts. On a surface level, the narrative had multiple goals relating to its nature as a prequel. It provides context for Cloud's memories and trauma, where he got the Buster Sword, why Sephiroth goes from being the world's most famous war hero to a mass murderer with a god complex, and why the soldier program as a whole went downhill. Cloud was a Shinra infantryman who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, saw his home get burned to the ground by his hero, and got an immense amount of Mako poisoning as consolation. He suppressed his trauma by taking on the legacy and some of the personality of his role model and superior officer Zack, whom he also got the Buster Sword from. Zack got the Buster Sword from his mentor Angeal, wherein the Buster Sword was a family heirloom created by Angeal's father, both for his son to wield in Soldier, and also as a reminder of his honor and where he came from. Sephiroth became the villain we all love and hate by virtue of discovering the nature of his own existence. He wasn't born, he was made. His mother, Genova, wasn't whatever woman he had envisioned in his mind, but instead an ancient alien excavated by Shinra. Sephiroth isn't an underdog nobody without a father figure who rose through the ranks and became the world's greatest hero. He's a bioweapon, created through a combination of the life force of the planet itself and the cells of an alien conqueror bent on destroying it with the express purpose of reverse engineering a being with the abilities of the long-lost ancient Cetra civilization. Everything he had ever known was a lie. Granted, along the way of explaining all of this, the game does struggle with some inconsistent writing. Cloud, for example, is randomly incredibly strong for no explained reason pre-Mako infusion, being able to perform a leaping strike with the Buster Sword and ragdoll Sephiroth while impaled in a bloodlusted rage. But also, he's weak enough to be defeated by fodder enemies while defending Tifa for some reason. Characters also have an everlasting habit of speaking in incredibly vague implications and doublespeak rather than clearly or concisely communicating almost anything.
As if knowing your lines would grant you the power to rewrite them.
Speak plain.
With the worst offenders being Genesis, who speaks almost entirely in quotes to his favorite epic, Loveless, and Sephiroth himself. Even then, all of that is aside from the basic writing contradictions that crop up now and again, stories that are told almost exclusively in written exposition, and character dialogue that literally gets copy and paste repeated sometimes. But once you get past all of these, the overarching story gives way to deep characters with unique philosophies and motivations, a narrative of dreams, both realized and crushed. Something I want to touch on very, very briefly here, considering I'm almost certainly going to make more targeted videos about this game's characters later, is the arc of the first-class soldiers. Each soldier who reaches the peak of the program by ascending to Soldier First Class all embark on a similar journey. Admittedly, they may start this journey at different times and for different reasons, but they all go through the same journey and end with different results. Genesis, Angeal, Sephiroth, and eventually Zack all reach the pinnacle of power and authority within Soldier. And when they do, slowly, the cracks begin to show. The system that they had dedicated themselves to with loyalty, honor, and pride begins to show its corruption and imperfections from the top down, with the director of Soldier himself along with the scientists responsible for the program being at the center of it all. One by one, Genesis, Angeal, Sephiroth, and Zack become disillusioned with the program that they had all once held as their life's calling, and one by one, they all rebel. Genesis to get revenge for the imperfection of his creation and finding a way to survive, Angeal to avenge his mother and reclaim the honor of his family, Sephiroth to find and fulfill his true purpose after he realizes that he's the incarnation of a planet-conquering calamity, and Zack to finally become the hero that he'd always dreamt of once he realized that he'd been on the side of the bad guys all along. That, and of course, to pursue the furthest thing from the obedient killing machine that he was trained to be. To not only have been a hero, but also to have loved. When discussing the mechanics of Reunion, we have to explore the game's DMW system. DMW stands for Digital Mind Wave, and it's a way of having Zack's emotions manifest in combat with physical results. It operates a lot like a slot machine, and depending on what the numbers and pictures land on, the player will get different benefits. It's also worthy of note that the player can never roll with negative results. The DMW will never grant the player something bad, it will always be something good or nothing at all. How the slot machine rolls will change based upon two things: which character pictures you've unlocked for the machine, and how Zack is feeling at the time. By virtue of being governed by his emotions, the machine will gain a bias for rolling on a particular character that Zack feels strongly about, regardless of whether or not he feels positively or negatively toward that person, just feeling strongly toward that person. Examples of the benefits that you can roll include, but are not limited to, leveling up Zack, leveling up materia, infinite resources to use for a short duration, limit breaks for stats, limit breaks in general, use of your summon materia, and more. In order to roll a limit break, the DMW needs to roll all three of the same picture, regardless of what the numbers are. Doing so will grant you a limit break specific to that character. These include, but are not limited to, I hope you're seeing a pattern here on how much stuff is buried in this one mechanic, Octaslash for Sephiroth, Healing Wave for Aerith, Meteor Shots for Cloud, and Rush Assault for Angeal, among many others.
Why did I explode?
The same exact rule applies for getting your summons. The DMW just has to roll all 3 pictures of a given summon and you gain access to it. Finally, there's one thing I feel the need to include in my review for this game for literally no other reason whatsoever other than the fact that IGN themselves actually missed it, and I'ma treat you guys right. Their guide says that there are 18 total limit breaks in Reunion, but in reality, the truth is that there are 19 limit breaks, and you lose access to one of them. If you roll all 3 images of a blacked out character that you haven't discovered yet, Zack will gain access to the limit break Chain Slash. Chain Slash functions like a weaker version of Octaslash, and it will become inaccessible once you unlock every limit break because you will instead get the limit associated with the given character you rolled. So ultimately, you will never have access to more than 18 total limit breaks at one time, but Reunion does actually offer you one more. There is a lot to potentially unpack in terms of the visual and sound design present in Reunion, from the updated voice acting, to the DMW system using cutscenes of memories to inform you about your limit breaks, to the leitmotifs from several songs that all foreshadow the climax when the full version of Price of Freedom plays. But since this section is going to be too long already, I'm going to just choose to focus on the best and worst of the visual design. That is, except for one thing that admittedly has no real bearing on the score whatsoever, so tangent timestamp on screen because once again I've heard something that I can't unhear, and now I have to share it with you. There may be a whole one of you that's going to understand the following sentence, but there's a Shamotion in this Final Fantasy VII game. What's a Shamotion? Well, they're this random one-off alien race from Dragon Ball Z Broly. Z, not Super. Specifically, this brat in the slums market is a Shamotion. This kid basically exists exclusively to scam you, I hate him, and he's voiced by the same person who voiced the Shamotions in Team 4 Star's parody of Broly. So if for whatever reason you've had this undying urge to hear this literally nameless NPC say super out-of-pocket things, then I have good news for you!
Oh, come on! You saw, I've been here the whole time. Actually, we much enjoy the slavery.
Say what?
Guys, what's our safe word?
I watched Team 4 Star Abridged religiously in my formative years, and I can now recognize every random sound effect and voice from memory. Please, I have a— And now, back to your regularly scheduled whatever. Being a remake, one of the important things to address visually is how the game looks compared not only to its prior self, but also compared to its peers at the time of its release. Reunion does look good, although it's unfortunately overshadowed by other more successful remakes in recent memory. Most significantly, Crisis Core Reunion does not have the same level of visual fidelity as the recent remake of its older sibling, Final Fantasy VII. And if that's in question for anyone, just look at the differences between the opening cutscenes and between these close-ups of Zack. Even with the comparisons to competition notwithstanding, the game's visual fidelity isn't consistent even within itself. The cutscenes run at a different resolution and frame rate to the actual gameplay. Bear in mind that both of these images on screen right now were recorded at 2K resolution from the same recording session. This difference is made extremely obvious during a short slow motion scene of Zack walking away from camera, where seemingly they reduce the speed of the scene without increasing the frame rate to make it look smooth, making it look very choppy. Where the game's visual design shines is the game's visual storytelling. The symbol on the crossguard of Zack's sword being nearly identical to the symbol on his uniform belt shows how he really was tied to Soldier more than anything else until he matured. And it's only when he becomes a first class and begins to separate himself from Shinra that he is given the Buster Sword, a weapon that doesn't have the Soldier insignia on it. Although the most interesting and consistent element of showing how the events of the story are actively unfolding is the texturing design of the copy enemies. In the early game, they look identical to random Shinra soldiers or even to Genesis himself, but as Genesis and everything connected to Project G begins to slowly degrade as you fight them back throughout the story, colors of their clothes will start to fade, their hair slowly turning white, and their flesh beginning to show cracks and fall apart. Either enemies will end up looking like dried and crumbling husks of their former selves, or they will take drastic measures to save themselves, becoming far more monstrous than they began. Crisis Core suffers badly, in my opinion, from coming after Final Fantasy VII Remake. I understand why they released it after Remake. Crisis Core released after Final Fantasy VII, and so Crisis Core Reunion released in the same order after Final Fantasy VII Remake. But I can't help but feel like the fact that Reunion just didn't get the same level of detail and polish as Remake holds this game back a lot. Because it was reintroduced after that remake, you really can't help but compare it to it, and Reunion is at least slightly worse than Remake in almost every way. Combat is a bit clunkier, the game just flat out isn't as pretty to look at, levels are less interesting even though they matter more to the story, and while the whole slot machine governed by emotions thing is admittedly super fresh and unique and deserves how much credit for how fun it is, it also really feels like you're kind of selling the game on a gimmick. 3 out of 5 opinion score. It's mid. It's a good kind of mid, but it's still mid. I definitely had higher hopes for the game that weren't exactly paid off, but Zack is a great character whose story deserves to be told, and I'm probably going to expand on later. The game does a phenomenal job as a prequel by exploring the origins of Cloud and Sephiroth, and it's even more valuable now than it was then, because Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is making Yuffie a main character rather than an optional one. So this game exploring her origins and her childhood actually means something now. But enough about what I think. Is the game actually good? You know, I never owned a PSP. My first PlayStation was the PS5 I played this game on, so getting to play all of these games that came out when I was a little kid in remake form is pretty dope. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please consider supporting the channel by either becoming a member or a patron, and in the meantime, I have been LoneWolfyX, and I will see you, yes you, next time.